Good morning. So I posted on the D2L site the groups that won the Marketing Critical Thinking Challenge from last time concerning consumer behavior and marketing. I forgot one group because I actually could not read your handwriting. It's kind of important that I read your handwriting. So the group that included Mr. Daniel, Mr. Burnett, Ms. Smith, Mr. Everhart. What is the name of your group?
The 6 mark community.
The 6 mark. Oh, it looks like September. Make sure that I can read your writing. It's so important. That's a necessary element, particularly on names. So I want to make sure everybody gets their points. You what?
Said Ira's not writing.
Okay. Well, just make sure that I can read at least the names part of your writing. We talked about the idea in consumer behavior and marketing that a lot of it is predicated on what we might call rational actor theory. And I suggested to you that this traditional model of consumer behavior may not be applicable for the vast majority of marketing decisions that we make and purchasing decisions that we make as consumers, because a lot is involved in terms of just daily purchases of things that we already know or like, or they're impulse purchases, and so we don't go through this complete information search every single time we want to buy something. Today what we turn to is we turn to the business-to-business marketing sector of the course. And I want to talk about a couple of things before I give you today's Marketing Critical Thinking Challenge. And the first is that when we talk about business-to-business sales, this will be enormously important when we get to the chapters towards the end of the text that talks about selling and selling professionally. Because I would encourage those of you who haven't really decided on your major yet to think about the personal selling major or the professional sales major that we have in College of Business, because we have 100% placement in that major and our students are getting good jobs. And one of the hardest things that we have to do is we have to overcome this idea that students have that what we're talking about is selling like they do at the furniture store. There's a well-known furniture store in Oklahoma City. I'm sure you all have been to it at some point in your life. And the impression of a salesperson is the one that you get from that store or from visiting a used car lot on a Saturday afternoon. That's not what we're talking about. What we do and what we focus on is business-to-business selling. And our students are highly successful at that. They're all making, they graduate within a year. For the most part, the ones that I know of are making close to or well over 6 figures. And so if you're just a general business major, you might think about the professional selling major and switching into that major at this point in your career, because it's still early enough for you to do that without a great deal of trouble. And then for those of you that are general business majors, I would encourage you to think about the marketing major and choosing a substantive major. Marketing, of course, is the only fully integrated function of the firm, so I want to recruit you into marketing. But I don't think that you would be ill-served by doing that, so I think you ought to think about that. Now, again, I implied when we talked about consumer behavior that maybe a lot of our decisions are not necessarily rational. They're impulse-based. We're hungry, we're going through the grocery store, and we buy those items at the counter because we want something to stuff in our mouth on the way out the door and into the car before we get home, and so we may purchase more than we thought about. What I want you to think about is in the business-to-business context, is that more or less true of that context? In other words, is the rational actor theory more applicable to business sales than it is to business-to-consumer sales? And why is it more applicable, maybe, or less applicable? I don't know, depending on your argument, with regard to the business-to-business context. So I want you to think about 2 questions in your group, so I'll give you about 10 minutes. One is it more applicable in the business-to-business context? And justify your answer based on some stuff that you might have read about in the book, particularly with regard to the types of decisions that are made by businesses, the level of decision-making that's involved, and things like that. And I'll give you about 10 minutes, and then we'll talk about your answers in just a minute. So I think that the majority of you thought that businesses were more rational, and I think that is true because of what we talked about just a second ago, the fact that demand is derived. Businesses don't purchase something in and of them for their own sake. They purchase it so that they can make money, right? Even supplies that are purchased for use by the employees of the company are often in furtherance of the company's goals in order to fulfill customer order and satisfaction. However, let's think about this. What percentage of businesses fail within the first 5 years? A huge percent, right? Well over 50% fail within the first 5 years of business. And what percentage of products that even big businesses launch don't make it? Can you think of one that's a huge launch that fell totally flat? Most of the tablets that were launched after Apple launched their tablet were not big successes. Why? Apple already had the market. You all are too young to remember this, but at one point in time, Coca-Cola came out with something called New Coke, and it was a miserable failure. It was more like Pepsi, and it fell absolutely flat. It was one of the biggest marketing failures that we can think of. When we talk about branding, we'll talk about the valuation of brands, and Coca-Cola is one of the most valuable brands in spite of that marketing failure. So the nature and scope of business-to-business or business-to-institution marketing is different than it is to consumers. It's obviously a much smaller marketplace, so why would you want to sell in that marketplace rather than the business-to-consumer sellers? If you look at, there are 365 million people in the United States approximately. I don't know exactly, but we'll say around 365 million people, maybe more than that, right? How many businesses are there? Well, if we look at industrial markets, there are 7.7 million. There are 1.5 million retailers, 935,000 wholesalers, about 250,000 different types of governmental units if you include state, local, and federal governmental units and bureaus and agencies within those, things like that. So that's much, much smaller than the consumer marketplace, right? Even if you add all that up, it only comes to something like 9.7 million organizations out there. Why would you want to sell to that when you could sell to over 300 million in the population? Well, obviously somebody has to sell to it, right? Not everybody can be a consumer salesperson, right, or a consumer-focused business, right? Some people have to make the stuff that actually goes into making the stuff that consumers then use. And so that's an important consideration. It's also a lot easier in many respects to sell to that market because it is more rational, right? If you put together good products and services and things like that, you might be able to sell easier in that marketplace than you could in consumer sales, where it is highly emotional. But what's a disadvantage to that then, to selling the business-to-business cycle? Particularly for commissioned salespeople, which we'll talk about in the sales chapter. You have to sell to keep what?
Yes, you have to sell it at a cheaper rate.
Well, maybe.
Usually, like, well, in my profession anyways, when you sell to the business, you get some kind of wholesale deal.
Right. The markup is generally lower on business-to-business items, but they're usually buying what? Much larger quantities, right? So the sale is usually larger, and in terms of dollar amounts, the sale is usually larger, although the markup may be less. What else?
Less frequent.
Less frequent. Yeah, the time that it takes businesses to purchase is a lot longer than it is in the consumer market. So you have to think about that in terms of commission sales. In the company that I worked for example, we sold learning management systems to K-12 institutions and prisons and people like that. How long do you think it took to get a sale from a school district? It took over 2 years on average to get a sale. Because they would have to start thinking about it, right? We would approach them. Then they'd have to decide that they had to actually want the product, and they would talk to their teachers and things like that, which is something that a lot of you picked up on, that there are a lot more people involved in this decision-making process than there is just in the consumer decision-making process. However, even in the consumer process, you might have other people that influence you. For example, how many of you have a boyfriend, girlfriend, significant other? Okay, does that impact your decision in buying making? If you have kids, how many of you have children? Now you have to think about more people. But there's even more in the business-to-business context. In evaluating the business context, the North American Industrial Classification System, which is talked about in your book, is enormously important in telling us stuff and being able to analyze trends in industries that we want to look at and what the value of certain industries are. The marketing characteristics are different. The demand is, again, derived. It takes a lot longer in terms of the time in purchasing decision-making. A lot more people are involved in that. And so your text talks about buying centers. And that's one of the things that we have in large organizations like UCO. And so I actually did a study one time to figure out what it costs to replace the light bulbs in a classroom. And you might be amazed at the cost because we have a buying center. So you have to go over, if I decide that I need light bulbs in my classroom, I have to fill out a work order, which is turned into one of our department secretaries. She then inputs that into the facilities management database. That goes to a clerk who handles it and sends somebody out. But before it even got to that point, we had to go through the RFP. So we buy light bulbs like these in bulk, which is what you were talking about in terms of the size of the sale. They're buying in large volumes, and so each individual light, actually the cost of the light bulb may not be that much, but when you figure out that we have to go through a request for proposal for all these light bulbs, so we figure out all the kinds of light bulbs that we need on campus, right? And then we send that out to bid, because anything that's over $500 has to be competitively bid, unless you can do a sole source contract, which light bulbs are not a terribly unique item that you can get away with doing sole source on, right? So it starts with the buying of the light bulbs. That involves a purchasing agent writing an RFP, soliciting bids, then opening the bids, then looking at the bids to make sure that they were in the correct form and that they meet the requirements of the request for proposal. And then we actually purchase the light bulbs. Then it goes to the physical plant who gets the light bulbs. It has to go through receiving here, right? Who brings it in and then sends it to the physical plant. And then finally the light bulbs get to the classroom. I think I told you all, did I tell you all what it costs to change a light bulb? At the time I did the study, it was something like $100 to change a light bulb. The $100 light bulb. By the time I figured in everybody's hourly wages in that process. And so understanding this kind of organization is enormously complex and understanding the buying center. So we have professional purchasing agents, and by the way, we offer a professional purchasing manager's option in the College of Business here. So if you're interested in that, it's sort of the opposite side of sales, and it's actually included in the sales because you have to understand it from the buyer's perspective as well. And it's a lucrative field that you can go into. So these buying centers are made up of these cross-functional teams, like I just talked about, people from facilities management telling us what kinds of light bulbs we need, right? To people in the classrooms who actually use them telling us whether or not the lighting is good. Do you think the lighting is fairly good in here? This has been one of my constant complaints about teaching in this room, is that the lighting is always really down. Why do you think that is? It's great for an auditorium, because if you want to show stuff up on the screen, right, you want dim lights in front. But a lot of times, what I notice is that students have a hard time seeing me in the dim light, particularly on the video. So understanding those buying centers and the roles that are in them. There are users, that would be me, who turns on the lights, right? Influencers, people who don't actually make the decision on whether or not we're going to buy the light bulbs, but have influence in the process. That would be things like we had Dr. Morelli come and talk the other day when I had to go do my experiment in another class. He's the chief legal officer for the university, and so all contracts have to go through the office of the legal counsel and be approved so that they meet the form that's required by the state of Oklahoma in order to do business with it. Then we have the buyers who are the formal, they have the formal authority to purchase stuff. They can actually sign the requisitions and actually purchase it. The deciders, right? Who actually decides on awarding the bid? Well, it may not be the person who's actually purchasing it. If we decide to purchase stuff, so for example, I'm taking a sales team, again, my shameless plug for the sales team. If you can get on the sales team, we pay for you to go to competition. This year, for example, we're taking students to the International Collegiate Sales Competition, which is in Orlando, and that'll be in November. And the school pays for your entire expenses to go and compete at that competition if you can get on the sales team, so you might want to think about it. But we're buying tickets. So I have to go through, again, the purchasing office, which sends us a request for proposal out to travel agents to bid on the process. But I have a lot of decision as to whether or not we're going to purchase the tickets at that point, because it has to meet the times that we have to be able to go and fly and get to Orlando in time for the competition and then be able to get back in a reasonable amount of time. So I actually have the decision-making authority in that instance, but I'm not the one who actually purchases the tickets. And then gatekeepers are the people who control the flow in the buying process. So understanding all of that makes business-to-business context much more complex than the consumer behavior context. The information search is, of course, going to be longer, usually, in the business-to-business context, more rational, based on more factors, and it's going to take a lot longer. Of course, there are steps that can be eliminated depending on the type of buy, and you should know that for the exam. For example, when we buy a new product, we engage in a far more extensive investigation and search process than if it's simply a straight rebuy, where we already know basically what kinds of light bulbs we need. If we're buying, for example, new projectors in here, that may be a much more long process than the buying of light bulbs or copy paper or pens or things like that, which we buy on a continual basis, right? Because as we upgrade information and technology infrastructure in college, we have to be aware of what kinds of things that students need and how that's changed, and so those kinds of decisions take a lot longer. Do you all have any questions about the business-to-business context? All right? Well, if not, I'm going to give you some time. Your article reviews are due next Tuesday, I believe. So I'm going to give you some time to work on those if you need them or on your group project. Be sure and look at the requirements in the syllabi for how I will grade the article reviews, things like font size, page length, all of that is important. So cover page, stuff like that you need to be aware of. Does anybody have any questions on those? Yes. No, I need a hard copy. I want you to bring an old-fashioned copy. That's how I'm going to make sure I have the grade. All right? If you haven't gotten your first exam back to me, if I don't have them by next Tuesday, you're going to get a 0. You'll be very sorry for the grade, so make sure I have those back. Yes, sir. You have to staple or give me a URL. You can put the URL on the back page.